The night Dean Martin didn't laugh. 2 hours before the taping, Johnny Carson stood alone in his dressing room, holding a glass of water he had no intention of drinking. The ice had already melted. Outside, in the narrow corridor that connected his private space to Studio One, he could hear the familiar sounds of a television show preparing to happen. Stagehands testing microphones, the band running through their opening number, producers shouting last-minute notes to interns who would forget them immediately. But inside this room, there was only silence. And in that silence, Johnny understood something he had been avoiding for weeks. Tonight would be different. Tonight, Dean Martin was coming back to The Tonight Show, and something fundamental between them had already ended, even if neither man had said the words yet. Dean was supposed to arrive at 6. It was now 6:45. Johnny checked his watch, not because he needed to know the time, but because checking his watch gave him something to do with his hand. He had been performing this version of composure for so long that he sometimes forgot what the alternative looked like. Panic, maybe, or honesty. He set the water glass down on the counter and looked at himself in the mirror. The same mirror that had reflected his face before thousands of shows. The same lighting that made him look perpetually ready, perpetually in control. The man staring back at him was 58 years old, professionally charming and privately exhausted. He straightened his tie. The tie was perfect. It had been perfect 10 minutes ago, too. There was a knock. Not the sharp, confident knock of a producer with good news, but something soft, apologetic, almost. Johnny knew that knock. It was the knock that preceded bad news delivered gently. He opened the door to find Freddie DeCordova, his longtime producer, standing with his hands in his pockets and an expression that tried very hard to be neutral. "He's here," Freddie said. "But Johnny, you should know, he's not in great shape." Johnny nodded slowly, as if this information was new, as if he hadn't been preparing himself for exactly this moment since the day they booked Dean for tonight's episode. "Define not in great shape," Johnny said, though he already knew. Freddie looked down the hallway, then back at Johnny. "He's been drinking. Not fall down drunk, but you'll see it. The audience will see it." Johnny felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to grief. "Okay," he said quietly. "Give me 5 minutes, then bring him to the green room. I'll talk to him before we go on." But when Johnny walked into the green room 7 minutes later, Dean was already sitting on the couch, legs crossed, cigarette burning between 2 fingers, looking for all the world like a man who had nothing to apologize for. He smiled when Johnny entered, that famous Dean Martin smile, the one that had charmed audiences for 40 years, the one that promised fun and danger in equal measure. "Johnny," Dean said warmly, rising to shake his hand. His movements were steady, controlled. If you didn't know him, you might not notice anything wrong. But Johnny had known Dean Martin for 3 decades. He knew the difference between Dean performing sobriety and Dean actually being sober. This was a performance, not one of his better ones. "Dean," Johnny said, taking his hand. "Good to see you." They stood there for a moment, 2 men who had shared countless stages, countless late nights, countless unspoken understanding. And in that moment, Johnny realized that Dean knew. Dean knew that Johnny knew. And neither of them was going to acknowledge it, because that was the rule. That had always been the rule. You perform, you smile, you never let them see you broken. "How have you been?" Dean asked, sitting back down, gesturing for Johnny to join him. Johnny sat. The couch was uncomfortably soft, the kind of furniture designed to look good rather than to actually support human bodies. "Busy," Johnny said. "You know how it is. 5 shows a week, every week, forever." Dean laughed, a short, rough sound that didn't quite reach his eye. "Forever? Yeah, that's the deal, isn't it?" He took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly. "Until it isn't." There was something in the way he said it. Something final. Johnny felt that tightness in his chest again. "You feeling okay?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. Dean looked at him, really looked at him, and for just a second, the mask slipped. Johnny saw exhaustion there, loneliness, the kind of weariness that sleep doesn't fit. Then Dean smiled again and the mask was back. "Never better, Pally," he said. "Never better." They talked for another 10 minutes. Safe topic, all the weather. A mutual friend who had just bought a house in Palm Springs. Neither of them mentioned Dean's son, who had died in a plane crash 3 years earlier. Neither of them mentioned the fact that Dean had barely worked since then, that his performances had become erratic, that the man who had once embodied effortless cool now seemed to be holding himself together with sheer willpower and alcohol. These were not things you talked about. Not in the green room. Not before a show. Maybe not ever. When Freddie knocked to tell them it was time, Dean stood smoothly, stubbed out his cigarette, and straightened his jacket. "Let's give them a show," he said. Johnny stood too. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Let's do that." The walk from the green room to the stage felt longer than usual. Johnny could hear the audience, that low rumble of anticipation, 300 people waiting to be entertained, to laugh, to forget their own lives for an hour. This was the sound he had built his career on. This was the sound that had justified everything. The divorces, the loneliness, the relentless schedule that left no room for anything resembling a normal life. He loved that sound. He needed that sound. But tonight, walking beside Dean Martin, he felt something else underneath, something heavier. The band started playing. The audience erupted. Johnny walked through the curtain and into the light, smiling that smile, waving that wave. Doc Severinsen and the band were perfect, as always. Ed McMahon was already at his post, laughing that big, reassuring laugh. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the man waiting in the wings, and the fact that both of them knew this was goodbye. Johnny did his monologue. The jokes landed. The audience loved him. This was what he was good at, finding the rhythm of a room, knowing exactly when to pause, when to smirk, when to let silence do the work. He talked about politics, about Hollywood, about the absurdities of daily life. He made it look easy because he had done it 5,000 times, because easy was the only way he knew how to do it. When he introduced Dean, the audience went wild. People stood, they cheered. They loved Dean Martin, loved the movies, the music, the Rat Pack legend, the persona of the man who never took anything seriously, who breezed through life with a drink in one hand and a song in the other. Dean walked out, smiling, waving, soaking in the applause. And Johnny watched him and saw something the audience couldn't see. The way Dean's smile tightened slightly at the corner. The way he gripped the chair a little too firmly when he sat down. The way his eyes, behind all that charm, looked empty. "Dean Martin, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, and the audience applauded again. Dean waved them off modestly. Stop, he said, grinning. "You're embarrassing me." But he wasn't embarrassed. He was performing not being embarrassed, which was Johnny knew the difference. They started with the easy. Dean told a story about Frank Sinatra and a bottle of Jack Daniels and a misunderstanding at a restaurant in Vegas. The audience laughed. Johnny laughed. Dean laughed. Everyone was laughing, except that Johnny could see the slight tremor in Dean's hand when he reached for the coffee mug on the side table. He could see the way Dean's eyes didn't quite focus when he looked at the audience. He could see the performance of Dean Martin happening in real time, and could see the real Dean Martin somewhere underneath, frowning. "So," Johnny said, keeping his voice light, "what have you been up to lately? We haven't seen you in a while." It was a gentle question, set up for Dean to promote a new project, tell a funny anecdote, keep the energy moving. But Dean just looked at him for a moment, long enough that Johnny felt the audience shift slightly, sensing something off. "You know, Johnny," Dean said finally, "I've been thinking about that. What have I been up to?" He paused. The pause went on too long. "Not much, if I'm being honest." Johnny felt the room change. The lightness was gone. This was not where the conversation was supposed to go. He tried to steer it back. "Well, you've been taking it easy, right? Enjoying life? That's what retirement's for." Dean smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Retirement," he repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" The audience laughed nervously, unsure if this was part of the bit or something else. Johnny felt himself shifting into crisis mode, the mode he always went into when something threatened to go wrong on live television. His job, always, was to protect the show, protect the guest, protect the audience from discomfort. "Hey, you've earned it," he said smoothly. 50 years in the business, all those movies, all those records. If anyone's earned the right to slow down, it's you." Dean looked at him, really looked at him, and Johnny saw recognition there. Dean knew what Johnny was doing. Dean knew he was being managed. "Yeah," Dean said softly. "Slow down. That's one way to put it." He reached for the coffee mug again, took a sip. His hand was steadier now, but only because he was concentrating on keeping it steady. "Truth is, Johnny, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I get up in the morning and I think, what for? Used to be I'd have a show to do, a song to record, somewhere to be. Now?" He shrugged. "Now it's just me and the house and the memories." The studio was very quiet. This was not entertainment. This was not what people tuned in for. This was something real, something raw, something that didn't belong on television at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. Johnny felt torn between two instincts: professional instinct to redirect, make a joke, save Dean from himself, and the human instinct to let his friends speak, to let this moment be what it needed to be. He chose the human instinct. "The memories are tough sometimes," Johnny said quietly. It wasn't a question. Dean nodded. Yeah, they are." He looked out at the audience, but Johnny wasn't sure Dean was actually seeing them. "You know what the hardest part is? It's not the grief. Grief makes sense. You lose someone, you grieve. That's natural. The hardest part is the not knowing what comes next. When you've spent your whole life performing and then suddenly you're not performing anymore. What are you? Who are you?" Johnny didn't have an answer. He had asked himself the same question 1,000 times, usually at 3 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come and the house was too quiet and the next show seemed both too far away and too close. He had never found a good answer. "I think," Johnny said slowly, "you're still you. Just a quieter version." Dean laughed, a real laugh this time, not performed. Quieter version of Dean Martin. Now that's a contradiction in terms. The audience laughed too, grateful for the release, for permission to find something funny again. But Johnny could see that Dean's eyes were wet. Not crying exactly, just wet. "I miss him," Dean said suddenly. "Every day, I miss him." He didn't say who. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. The audience knew. Johnny knew. Dean's son, Dean Paul Martin, had died in 1987. It was now 1989, and Dean was still stuck in that moment, unable to move forward, unable to move back. Johnny felt something break inside him, some professional boundary he had maintained for 30 years, some wall between Johnny Carson the performer and Johnny Carson the human being. He reached over and put his hand on Dean's arm, just rested it there. Cameras were rolling, the audience was watching, but in that moment Johnny didn't care. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you do." They sat like that for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. Then Dean took a breath, straightened up, and the performer came back. "Well," he said, smiling that smile again, "this got depressing fast, didn't it?" The audience laughed, relieved. Johnny smiled. "Little bit, yeah. Did I sing something? Cheer everybody up?" "I'd love that," Johnny said, and he meant it. Dean stood and walked over to the band. He looked steadier now, Or maybe Johnny just wanted to believe he looked steady. Doc Severinsen counted them in, and Dean started to sing. It was Everybody Loves Somebody, his biggest hit, a song that had defined him for a generation. His voice was rougher than it used to be. Not as smooth, not as effortless, but there was something in it, something underneath the roughness that was more honest than any polished performance could have been. He sang about love, about finding someone, about happiness. And Johnny sat there watching him and thought about how strange it was that Dean Martin, of all people, was singing about love while clearly dying of loneliness. The audience clapped along. They swayed. They smiled. They had no idea they were watching a man say goodbye. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. Dean bowed, waved, came back to the couch. Dean Martin, everybody, Johnny said, and his voice was steady, professional, perfect. Dean sat down, breathing a little heavily from the exertion. You've still got it, Johnny said. Whatever it is, you've still got it. Dean smiled. Muscle memory, Pally. That's all it is. The body remembers even when the brain does. They talked for another few minutes. Light stuff. Safe stuff. The kind of conversation two old friends have when they both know they're performing friendship rather than actually having it. And then Freddie was giving the signal, and it was time to go to commercial. And Johnny was thanking Dean for coming. And Dean was standing, shaking his hand, waving to the audience one more time. But before he walked off stage, Dean turned back. Just for a second. He looked at Johnny, and Johnny looked at him, and something passed between them. Not words, not even a clear emotion, just an acknowledgement, a recognition that both of them were trapped in their own versions of the same prison, prison of performance, never being allowed to stop, never being allowed to be anything other than what the audience needed them to be. Then Dean walked off stage, through the curtain, and out of the light. Johnny turned to the camera, made a joke about something, introduced the next guest. The show went on. It always went on. That was the whole point. The show going on was more important than anything else, more important than grief and loneliness and the slow dissolution of a human being happening in real time on national television. After the show, Johnny went back to his dressing room. He sat in the same chair, in front of the same mirror, under the same light. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 hours earlier. The tie was still perfect. The hair was still in place. The face was still the face of Johnny Carson, master of late-night television, the man who made it look easy. He sat there for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just sitting. There was a knock. Freddie, probably, coming to debrief, to discuss the show, to plan tomorrow. Johnny didn't answer. Eventually, the knocking stopped. He heard footsteps walking away. He continued sitting. Outside, he could hear the crew breaking down the set, turning off lights, packing away cables. The sound of a television show ending. The sound that happened every night, 5 nights a week, 50 weeks a year. The sound that would continue long after Johnny was gone, long after Dean was gone, long after everyone who had been in that studio tonight was gone. Later, much later, Johnny would learn that Dean Martin never performed on television again after that night. That Dean spent the remaining years of his life mostly alone, mostly silent, mostly just waiting for what Johnny was never sure. Maybe for the pain to stop, maybe for permission to stop performing, maybe for nothing at all. Johnny would think about that night sometimes, in his own later years, after he had finally left The Tonight Show, after he had finally stopped performing 5 nights a week, after he had finally discovered what came next, which turned out to be not much, a quieter version of himself, just as he had told Dean, a version that didn't need applause, didn't need cameras, didn't need to be anything other than what it was. But he never forgot the look in Dean's eyes that night, the emptiness underneath the charm, the performance of Dean Martin happening on top of the reality of Dean Martin, and the widening gap between the two. He never forgot the moment when Dean had asked, "Who are you when you're not performing?" Because Johnny had spent his entire life avoiding that question, had built an entire career, an entire public persona, an entire version of himself around not having to answer it. And watching Dean, watching the disintegration of a man who had run out of performance, who had nothing left to hide behind, Johnny had seen his own future. Had seen what happened when the lights finally went off, and the audience finally went home, and there was nothing left but the person you had been avoiding being for 50 years. It terrified him, not in a dramatic, overwhelming way, but in a quiet, persistent way. The way water terrifies by wearing down stone, not through force, but through patience. The night Dean Martin didn't laugh, because that's how Johnny thought of it afterward, even though Dean had laughed plenty, had performed laughter expertly, was the night Johnny Carson understood that success and happiness were not the same thing. That you could be beloved by millions and known by no one. That you could spend your whole life making people laugh and never experience joy yourself. These were not new thoughts. Johnny had thought them before, in various forms, at various times. But that night, watching Dean, he felt them. Felt them in a way that made them impossible to ignore. And yet, he went back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Because that was the job, because the show must go on, because Johnny Carson was a professional, and professionals don't stop just because they're tired, just because they're lonely. just because they've glimpsed something true about themselves that they'd rather not have seen. In the car on the way home that night, Johnny sat in the back seat and watched Los Angeles pass by outside the window. The city looked the same as it always did, lights and traffic and people going about their lives, unaware that anything significant had happened. And maybe nothing significant had happened. Maybe it was just another show, another guest, another hour of television that people would forget by morning. But Johnny didn't think so. He thought something had ended that night, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture or final statement, but ended nonetheless. The friendship between Johnny Carson and Dean Martin, whatever form it had taken, was over. Not because either of them wanted it to be, but because both of them were too tired, too trapped in their own performances to maintain even the fiction of connection. They had looked at each other and seen mirrors, and neither of them had liked what they saw. Johnny never called Dean after that night. Dean never called Johnny. This was not unusual. Johnny was not good at maintaining friendships. He was good at maintaining performances of friendships. The public handshake, the warm introduction, the inside joke that suggested intimacy without requiring it. But actual friendship, the kind that involves calling someone just to talk, that involves showing up when things are hard, that involves being present in ways that don't involve cameras or audiences, that was not something Johnny knew how to do. Or maybe it was something he had known once and forgotten. The way you forget a language you spoke as a child, the shape of it still there in your mouth, but the words gone. When Dean Martin died in 1995, Johnny was no longer hosting The Tonight Show. He had retired 3 years earlier, had finally walked away from the studio, from the cameras, from the nightly performance of being Johnny Carson. He was living quietly, playing tennis, spending time alone, being that quieter version of himself he had mentioned to Dean. He heard about Dean's death on the news, the way most people did. There was no phone call from a mutual friend, no personal notification. Just a news anchor delivering the information in that practiced, sympathetic tone that news anchors use for celebrity deaths. Dean Martin, the legendary entertainer, has died at age 78. Johnny sat in his living room and watched the clips they showed. Dean singing, Dean laughing, Dean with Frank and Sammy, Dean in his prime. They showed a clip from The Tonight Show, from one of Dean's earlier appearances when they were both younger, both still convinced that the performance was enough. They didn't show the final appearance, the one where Dean had stopped performing for just a few minutes, the one where he had asked the question that neither of them wanted to answer. Johnny watched the news coverage and felt what? Sadness, certainly, but also something like recognition. Dean had finally stopped, had finally found whatever came after the performance, and whether that was peace or just nothing, at least it was no longer the exhausting maintenance of a persona that had stopped fitting years ago. Johnny thought about calling Dean's family, thought about attending the funeral, thought about all the things you're supposed to do when someone you knew for 40 years dies. He didn't do any of them, not because he didn't care, but because doing them would require explanations he didn't have, would require emotions he couldn't access, would require being a person he had spent his entire life not being. So he sat in his living room, in the house that was too big for one person, in the silence that he had finally learned to tolerate if not embrace, and he remembered. He remembered the night Dean Martin didn't laugh, the night when the mask had slipped and two performers had looked at each other and seen the cost of their success reflected back. The night when Dean had asked who you are when you're not performing, and Johnny had known the answer was nobody, nothing, a blank space where a person should be. Years later, in his own final years, Johnny would sometimes think about Dean's question. He never found a satisfying answer. He found a life of sorts, quiet, private, carefully controlled. He found ways to fill his days that didn't require applause. He found a kind of contentment that was related to happiness the way photographs are related to actual memories, similar but fundamentally not the same thing. But he never found out who he was when he wasn't performing. Because even in retirement, even in privacy, even alone, he was still performing. Performing retirement, performing privacy, performing the role of Johnny Carson after The Tonight Show. It was all he knew how to do. And maybe that was okay. Maybe some people are performers all the way down, with no authentic self hidden underneath, just layers of performance stacked on top of each other, each one as real as the last. Or maybe that's just what performers tell themselves. The night Dean Martin didn't laugh was not the night Dean Martin died. It was not the night Johnny Carson quit television. It was not in any objective sense a particularly significant night. The ratings were fine, the show was fine, life went on. But it was the night two men who had spent their lives making other people happy looked at each other and admitted, without words, that they had failed to make themselves happy. That the bargain they had struck, fame and success in exchange for privacy and authenticity, had not been worth it, and that there was nothing to be done about it now. The show must go on. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. Even when you no longer believed in the show, even when you no longer believed in much of anything, you smile, you wave, you make the audience laugh, you give them what they came for. And then you go home to your empty house and your melted ice and your perfect tie, and you wait for tomorrow when you'll do it all again. Because what else is there? Because this is who you are. Because stopping would mean answering that question, who are you when you're not performing? And neither Johnny Carson nor Dean Martin ever found an answer they could live with. So they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They just kept going, kept performing, kept smiling, until eventually the body gave out and the performance ended whether they wanted it to or not. And maybe that's mercy. Maybe that's the only ending that makes sense. Not a choice, but an inevitability. Not a decision, but a surrender. The curtain falls, the lights go off, the audience goes home, and what remains is not a person, but the memory of a performance, which in the end might be all any of them ever were.